Today we're kicking off our NHL season preview series. We're starting with the North Division for the Canadian teams, and we're starting with the Montreal Canadiens. We'll preview their season coming up next. So welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. Now, as I mentioned, we're starting season previews here today. I know we're a little bit late getting onto this, and we probably won't get to every single team, but I do want to at least focus to start with on the North Division, or the Canadian Division, I guess, sponsored by Scotiabank. Of course, the NHL now has sponsors for their divisions. Coming into the 21 season, trying to find new ways to generate revenue here. So how we're going to break down the season previews here is as follows. We're going to do a quick recap of last year's season, see where they finished. We're going to take a look at what I feel were their main objectives heading into the NHL offseason. We're going to take a look at additions and subtractions on how the roster has changed, and then discuss some key players and performances that we need to see for the coming season. I'll give you my thoughts on how they will do. So let's get things off here first by recapping quickly how they did last season. Now, of course, as we know, when the NHL season was paused, the Montreal Canadiens were not in a playoff spot. They were basically a 500 team with a record of 31-31-9 for 71 points. Had they been able to complete the full season, they were on pace for about 82 points in 82 games. So not fantastic. Certainly was down from the year before where they had 96 points. They kind of been yo-yoing the last few years. It kind of gets a little bit tough to predict what you're going to see. But this year, though, we saw way more change with this franchise than we have in quite some time. So I do think things are a little bit easier for me to predict. But at the same time, with different divisions, it's not going to be an easy season for any of our teams here in Canada. They're going to have a lot of hard games. And, of course, with a unique format as well, will certainly make things very, very challenging. Now, last season, of course, we know they ended up getting into the playoffs because of the expanded format. They went in as the lowest ranked team in the Eastern Conference and surprised the Pittsburgh Penguins, winning in the qualifying round. So technically they qualified for round one of the Stanley Cup playoffs. And then they had a very tough series as well against the Flyers and ended up ultimately falling to defeat there. But still, they, I think, surprised themselves and certainly looked to be much stronger than many people thought. Their play in the bubble and the return to play was much better than the regular season. They saw some incredible growth from some key young players as well, like Kotkaniemi and Suzuki. There's a couple of key contributors, stronger all around, really, which helped them ultimately eliminate one of the strongest teams that we've seen in the last while, the Penguins, in a relatively short series that Montreal went on to win. Now, let's take a look now at what I feel their team objectives were heading into the NHL offseason. This is what Marc Bergevin's goals were before making any moves this offseason. First up, he definitely wanted to add some grit and make the team tougher to play against. There's no doubt that Montreal has been a smaller team for quite some time, and some historically speaking, really, even if you look back the last 20, 30 years, they've really haven't always had a ton of size. They're typically a lot of times smaller, speedier type players, and that has not been working on a consistent basis. So definitely adding some grit, some size, and tougher to play against was a big time part of their goals for this offseason for sure. Obviously, they wanted to improve their overall team defense. Last year, Carey Price's numbers weren't great, but they certainly were not all his fault. I don't think he had a terrible year by any means. But the overall team defense, and that's to not only the blue liners, but to a degree in the forward group as well, to kind of make things better. And of course, I think that along with at least some minor improvements for Price to bounce back will result in some much better Team D. And of course, they really wanted to add to their depth up front. They needed some more secondary scoring. They needed to rely on getting some offense from a higher variety of forwards. So now we're going to take a look at the roster changes and see how they've addressed those needs heading into the 2021 NHL season. Now, if you take a look at first at who are the subtractions, who's no longer with this club, there's not a lot of them. There's way more new faces than ones that have left. But of course, Max Domi was traded. Of course, he had a lot of rumors surrounding him for some time. Was in need of a new contract, and he was swapped to the Columbus Blue Jackets. They finally got out from underneath the Karl Alzner contract through a buyout. And we also saw longtime player Dale Weiss, who's been in and out of the Habs lineup and had a couple tenures with the team, not be re-signed. So he effectively left as a free agent, which I believe he's over in Europe. I'm not sure where he's exactly going to get a contract next, but Weiss is no longer with the Montreal Canadiens. Now, looking at the new faces, the additions to this roster, there's many of them, some of which came through trade, most of which came through the free agent route. Now, of course, as I mentioned, Max Domi was traded to Columbus. In return, they get Josh Anderson, of course, who's a big, strong, power forward type of player. Now, he was ultimately given a long-term contract, and I really hope for their sake that the contract doesn't come back to bite them. But Josh Anderson's a terrific hockey player, but he was giving a lot of term and a lot of money for somebody who hasn't really had that long-term success, at least not yet, at the NHL level. But I do think that the risk associated with the contract could be offset by the reward they get. They very well could get themselves a solid 20 to 30 goal scorer for an extended number of years here. Of course, they also brought in some goaltending help and Jake Allen from St. Louis. That was one of the first moves of the offseason. They saw that opportunity to add an experienced backup from the Blues who needed to shed salary. They had the space at that point to take on a little bit more of an expensive backup to make sure Price didn't have to play as much. And obviously, especially in a condensed season, that's going to become very helpful as well. So obviously, they add some much-needed depth there and some great experience. Of course, Jake Allen has a Stanley Cup from a couple of years ago. We've also seen some additions on the blue line. Primarily, they made a trade and then ultimately a sign because they acquired the rights to defenseman Joel Edmondson from the Carolina Hurricanes. Of course, Edmondson is a player that the Habs were keen on. It certainly adds a lot of size, and it's somebody that they feel will make them tougher to play against and add some grit back there. I mean, he's not, a super physical player based on how big he actually is, in my opinion, but somebody that they feel will certainly help in that regard. He's certainly a big guy and relatively mobile for his size here as well. They're also going to have newcomer and rookie Alex Romanov finally coming over to sign from Russia, one of their top prospects they've had in their system for a few years now, ready to make his debut. Certainly seems like a versatile defenseman who could probably play either side since they have more left side than right side defenseman. They are experimenting in camp with him on the right side. So far, things look decent. So they very well could start him out there, but he's definitely going to have a regular role in Montreal. I don't see him being too sheltered, maybe a little bit to start, but at the end of the day, Romanov's going to be a big part of this team here for a long time. Of course, also in the forward group, they signed free agent forward Tyler Toffoli, who's also another guy with a great experience track record here with multiple Stanley Cups to his name, a guy who's a proven scorer in the past as well, gets a relatively healthy free agent contract from Montreal, so they add him along with Anderson, a couple of really solid options who should add some much more secondary depth scoring on the wings, which should be huge for them. I mean, they're deeper now up front that one of these guys, likely Toffoli, quite possibly could find himself playing on the third line. Then lately here, they've added even more veteran depth just to make them even more deeper, given the fact that, it's a unique season. They could run into COVID issues, they could run into injury issues, and they want to have as much experience around as they can to mix in with their young players. So they signed longtime veteran Carey and veteran Michael Frolik, both to 1 year cheaper contracts. So that's certainly going to add another element, especially in Carey's case, going to help them be a tougher team to play against. We saw what role he played for Dallas last year in the playoffs, especially. He didn't have a terrific regular season, but when it matters most in those key games, that's when he seems to elevate his play, and Carey will not be fun for the other opposing teams to play against. So when you take a look at all those additions, that to me says that the blue line is going to be a little bit bigger, a little bit more mobile, given the addition of Romanov, a size from Edmondson. You've got, obviously Anderson and Toffoli and Perry, so you've got some size there. Obviously Perry's a good size forward. You get Josh Anderson's a big boy. Toffoli's not overly huge, but certainly adds somebody who's a goal scorer with some extra decent defensive play in there as well. So overall, these additions by Marc Bergevin and the Montreal Canadiens are all relatively solid adds here, in my opinion. Now we're going to take a look at some key players. We're going to take a look at players who I feel need to be a bounce-back player candidate, a breakthrough player candidate, and any players who kind of fall into that uncertain future candidate. Obviously, all teams have players that have been either in the trade rumor mill, they might be extra parts, they might be guys that are on expiring contracts, and we just don't know how long they're going to be with this NHL team. And I'll give you my thoughts as well on how I feel the Habs are going to finish this season. Now, as far as breakthrough performances from the Montreal Canadiens this year, I think that kind of player needs to be Jesperi Kotkaniemi. We saw a bit of a breakthrough in the bubble during the 2020 return to play in the playoffs there. He was one of the big reasons why they were able to defeat Pittsburgh and have some playoff success. Even though they didn't get too far, they still surprised, like I said, many, including probably themselves. And Kotkaniemi certainly showed a lot more ability to be a regular player and contribute than he did earlier in the season. He even spent part of the time in the minors before that. So certainly looked like it might be a little bit of that sophomore jinx that we sometimes see, where in second-year players sometimes take a step back before they take a big step forward. But, with the break in between the pause, maybe he was able to do enough, gain enough confidence and strength and etc. that maybe that was enough of a break to kind of get him rejuvenated to come back. But to me, Kotkaniemi needs to be a player to really break through for this team. I'm not including Nick Suzuki in it because I think he really kind of broke through last year. I think he'll continue to break through and still get better. Nick Suzuki has number one center potential longer term for them as well. Obviously a great pickup in that trade for Max Pacioretty. That trade is still paying dividends here as well, and will for a long time given the emergence now of Suzuki. But as far as other breakthrough players, I think we could see a guy like Alex Romanov have more of an impact as well on that blue line for Montreal. Like I said, I'm not sure he's going to be given a huge role, but I don't think they're going to shelter him too much either. I can see him kind of maybe getting second pair opportunity, but they very well could keep him in the third pair just to kind of take the pressure off here a little bit, at least to start the season. As far as bounce back players go, I'm going to put Carey Price on this list because like I said, even though last year I don't feel Carey Price was terrible and really had a really bad season, I do think he could have been a little bit better, and I think that overall his play will get better as a result of other moves we've seen the team make. Like, for example, they can afford to rest Carey Price a little bit more with a condensed schedule, more back-to-backs. Getting an experienced backup like Jake Allen's going to help immensely, as well as the improvements they made on the blue line and even within the forward group as well. Overall, if the team defense is better, they're not going to be giving up so many grade A opportunities and odd man rushes, etc., which is certainly difficult on a goaltender, and sometimes goalies get too much of the blame when it's really not entirely their fault that the other team is getting the chances that they actually end up getting. Of course, on this list for bounce back players, I'm also going to put Josh Anderson because last year was a bit of a write-off for him. He barely played, was out most of the year injured. Obviously, when he did play, the offense wasn't there. So, he needs to bounce back and earn this new contract, this new opportunity. I know so far in training camp, he's looked pretty good. So I think we have a lot of reason to be optimistic about how he'll fit in and how he'll play with Montreal. But clearly, he needs to get back to what he was a couple of years ago with Columbus, and that was a 20-goal scorer, and see if he can even take it up a notch from there, because he's still young enough that it's fair to say he has not truly peaked and has not kind of hit his prime years. He is not tapped out yet. He can get better, and obviously we'll see what he can do with some new line mates and a new opportunity with the Montreal Canadiens. As far as players that I'm going to label as uncertain future, there's got a couple of forwards in that category, which is going to be Philip Deneau and Tomas Tatar. Now, of course, the reason for that is the Habs' tight cap situation, the fact that they're on expiring contracts, and they're both players, for the most part, who have been kind of mentioned in the rumor mill as some guys who may not be with the team long term, especially Philip Deneau, after he made comments of after the bubble in last year's playoffs, that he wasn't real crazy about being a third-line player. Obviously, players like Suzuki and Kotkaniemi did outplay Deneau and certainly gained more of the offensive roles during the bubble, and I don't think he was too pleased with that. Now, he's also made additional comments kind of clarifying the fact on, that he doesn't necessarily want to be traded or anything like that, but obviously he wants to get the role that he feels he deserves, and he's been given an opportunity to be a top-line player for a long time. And as I mentioned before, as much as I love Philip Deneau and his great two-way play that's really emerged in the last few years, he's typically not a number one center on most teams, and was really only given that opportunity due to the lack of depth in the organization. Ideally, on most teams, he would be a number 2 or number 3, a guy who can chip in offensively, be good on faceoffs, and be really responsible defensively, and be a guy who you can mention in the Selke conversation. He has tons of value for sure, but obviously, long term, they may have a hard time fitting in a new contract for him based on what his new salary is going to be, while at the same time trying to extend their young players like Suzuki and Kotkaniemi coming out of their entry-level contracts needing big raises. So it's going to be interesting to see how they handle things. I'm not sure that they really want to move him again. I'm not sure he wants to go either. But depending on what they see for him as his long-term role, as well as what that next contract's going to look like, might be just a matter of not being able to afford him. So I think they obviously might have to move on from Deneau as much as they may not want to. Now, when it comes to Tatar, the same sort of thing kind of applies here. Obviously, salary cap logistics will play a big role. But obviously, some of these other veterans that they've added are short-term one-year contracts, so they may not stick around beyond the current season. Obviously, some guys like Toffoli and Anderson are on a bit of a longer-term contract as well, so that will obviously be an impact. We saw Brendan Gallagher get a big extension too. So is Tatar going to be a part of that top 6 beyond this year? It's difficult to say. I mean, he's been one of their top scoring forwards really ever since he's arrived. In the last few years have been really a solid addition having Tatar there, but I wonder what their plans are for him. It's not quite clear where he's not extended yet, if he has a future with the club beyond the current season. Now, I guess if Montreal does stumble and it's looking like they're going to finish out of the playoffs, it'd be interesting to see if guys like Deneau or Tatar ended up getting traded at the deadline. I know trades might get complicated as we get closer to that, given depending on what teams are going to, because there could be some quarantine rules in place that could cause some delays getting into the lineup. But I guess some teams listening to GMs and different sources around the league don't really feel it's going to be a big issue. If at the end of the day, a trade's a trade, and if it's going to better your team and give you a better chance to win a Stanley Cup, I think we're still going to see moves. It just might be a little bit more complicated as usual. I think the Habs are going to be a greatly improved team. They've certainly, I think, have accomplished a lot of their goals this year. They added the necessary depth. They've certainly added the right players to be tougher to play against. They've added some size. They get some more grit. I think this team is going to be a bit of a surprise and will give some more offensively powerhouse teams like the Leafs and the Oilers, for example, a pretty good run for their money. I can certainly see Montreal being within the top 4 to make the playoffs. I don't think that's too far of a stretch at all. As far as where they finish exactly, it's really tough to say, but I will not be surprised if I see them grab a top 3 spot. I still see other media outlets and even other channels forecasting them to be anywhere from 4th, 5th, 6th in the division. I really don't see that being the case. I think when it comes to teams like the Canucks, the Jets, even the Flames for sure, I do think they're going to be able to compete night in and night out and will win more often than not. The teams that I feel are going to be more offensively gifted would be like the Leafs and the Oilers, and I'm not sure that they're any worse for wear when it comes to goaltending and defense. So I think they're going to be competing right along with some of these teams. We're going to have a very interesting, tight finish. I don't think spots 1 through 6 are really going to be all that far apart. I think we're going to see small margins in a really tight divisional race that'll keep us interested right down to the wire. So, of course, as always, want to know what your thoughts are on this team. What do you see coming up for the year for the Montreal Canadiens? Where do you think they'll finish? What do you think of their moves they made this offseason? Leave your comments down below and we'll discuss further. If you're new to the channel, consider subscribing and turning on your notifications so you don't miss any future content. And stay tuned for the next Canadian Division preview coming real soon. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time.